remembering someone who has passed away are very mixed occasions. On the one hand, there is extreme sorrow and sadness that the person is not here. And when one talks about the person, one keeps on remembering all kinds of closenesses that happened in the course of one's life with that person. On the other hand, it is also a celebration of that person. And I think that that is a very joyful aspect of the gathering, so that one doesn't just talk about the mournful aspect, but one does also remember that there is a celebratory aspect to it as well. I didn't know André very well. It was passing and casual, but very meaningful. I always looked forward immensely to getting together and chatting with him. I met André when I joined Delhi University in 1963. It was my first experience of faculty in Delhi University. I didn't really know very many people. And the history department then, in those years, 1963, was staffed largely by what some of us jokingly called the has-been historians. What did we mean by this? We meant that they were all historians that were trained 20, 30, 40 years ago and kind of refused to go on reading further. And we were, of course, spending our time trying desperately to change the syllabus and change the curriculum and make it closer to what was in those days called the new history, the history of society and economy and the relationships to various parts of the system. I would give my lectures, return to my room, and then wonder, where am I going to find all these bright academics that everybody talks about at Delhi University? And I was beginning to give up practically. But then there was a small group of us that developed historians, most of whom taught in the colleges. And they were good historians. And in fact, this group sort of gelled into a further little group that was keen on making changes. And we would meet and chat in the university coffee house over coffee and say, what should we do? How can we introduce new ideas and new systems? So we became a small group of protesters who wanted to improve the curriculum and the teaching of history. And of course, this was heavily resisted, but nevertheless, we continued. And then one fine day, I was introduced to what was then the hub, the gad, as it were, of the social sciences, the Delhi School of Economics. We sat in the tea room in the afternoon. I remember the first time when I went to the Delhi School of Economics. We sat in the tea room. And I was absolutely riveted seeing all the rock stars coming out to have tea. The rock stars of economics, like Shubhamoy Chakravarti, Amartya Sen, Jagdish Bhagwati. And then not far behind were the rock stars of sociology. M.N. Srinivas, André Béteille, and in a later period joined by Jeet Uberoi. And the latter group was very close to my own interest in social history. And it was a tea room, actually, going there every day and sitting down and chatting with all these people that saved me from giving up on Delhi University. And I made a special point of seeking out André and talking to him because I'd heard of some of his new ideas relating to the functioning of societies, and I was intrigued. do keep in mind that not all historians are embedded in the remote past and remain embedded. There are many of us that do struggle out of the remote past into more recent times and try and apply what is being said and done to the remote past, but do it differently. My conversations, therefore, were much more with the sociologists and their theories about the culture and life of societies. And that is, of course, where André comes in. This was also the time when Indian history was breaking out of some of the shackles of colonial interpretations of the Indian past. Historians were now exploring other theories that touched on themes that were new and different. And there was a buzz in the air about, is this new? Why is it new? And what is the positive feature of this new element? History was moving from being a part of Indology to gradually becoming a social science. And so there we were, arguing about Srinivasa's idea of Sanskritization, which was being explored, rather unsuccessfully, I'm afraid, by a small group of us, historians, who were trying to see whether it could be applied to past societies. And I'm afraid we didn't get very far with that. And then I had long conversations with Dr. A.M. Shah about genealogies and lineages, because I was beginning to get very interested in genealogies and lineages, and he was the hotshot guy on genealogies and lineages. We didn't always agree, but even in the disagreements that I had with him, they were educated. And that was really saying a lot. And then there was André. André's ideas of understanding society and the status of people in the context of caste, class, and power. And these were three pillars, as it were, in some of his earlier writing, which we historians found extremely useful and challenging, and wanted to know more about it. I remember conversations about how one arrives at and understands hierarchy. Remember that hierarchy in those days, in the 1960s, was the buzzword. Dumont had used it, and Dumont was partly going back to Max Weber, and there was that side of sociology that was coming in. And hierarchy was important both in society, in units like clans and units like caste. The historian in us sort of said, does archaeology perhaps tell us more of the nitty-gritty of how a village functioned? And all we had was ancient texts. The ancient texts didn't talk too much about either the village or the lower levels of society. It talked mainly about upper castes and the well-to-do. And the questions that we were asking were that does the imprint of the modern village give us clues, because we cannot apply the imprint literally to the older material, but can it help us to ask questions? And this was something that I used to often discuss with André, that you ask these questions, we can't ask them directly of our data, but how could we turn them around a little bit and use them? And remember, of course, this was the time then when interdisciplinary research had arrived and was becoming very important and was beginning to launch into the social sciences. I learned much, a great deal in fact, from conversations with André and A.M. Shah over proverbial cups of coffee that were endless. A point of disagreement, however, with André that I recall, and I recall it very fondly, was that I was not so taken with Max Weber's understanding of religion in India. But it was an exciting argument to have with someone who really was well grounded in Max Weber. Studies of religion tended to draw fairly substantially on Sanskrit texts, but archaeology had other perspectives. For instance, religion in the Vedic texts of the mid-2nd millennium BC, describes enormous, really enormous altars for doing sacrificial rituals. 2 millennia later, the altars disappear. They're completely replaced by the worship of icons in temples. So obviously, the texts don't explain why this change is taking place, but we as social historians and historians of religion have to go into this question. And this is when I really did find my conversations very, very useful. History was beginning to reach out to other disciplines as part of its investigation. The history of caste had until then been seen by historians as being fairly static. Caste came, was established, and it stayed. It never changed. But now, with the new questions that we were asking, with the help of social anthropologists and sociologists, we began to recognize changes and mutations of a kind that we hadn't recognized in earlier generations of historians. And formulating even more searching questions became extremely central. My occasional conversations with André continued during the 7 years that I was in Delhi University. And then, late in 1970, both André and I received letters from the Vice Chancellor of JNU, G. Parthasarathi, inviting us to take up a chair in the newly founded Jawaharlal Nehru University. André and I discussed it again and again at length. We had a month in which to take a decision on whether we would move or not. So every week we'd get together over coffee and I would say, André, have you come to a decision? And he would explain why he had not, or why he was moving a little further in some direction, and I would sort of pose questions that worried me about making a change. I saw it as an opportunity to establish what was now being called the new history that was taking place all over the world, as it were. Essentially focusing on social and economic history for a start, replacing up to a point the emphasis that had earlier been given to political and diplomatic history, battles, kings, queens, that kind of thing, and really going into the question of what was society like, how did it function, and what does it tell us about that period. André was a little less sure about the mechanics of organizing a new syllabus and curriculum in a new university. This was a huge task, and I sometimes think that not all of us realized how huge it was until we started doing it, and that really took up the best part of our lives at that time. Institutions in India find it difficult to maintain high quality over long time periods. I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying this. I think it is true even now. We would meet, André and I, discuss the pros and cons, and leave the decision till tomorrow. And finally one day André said, I've decided I'm not going to JNU. He argued that rather than experimenting, he preferred to continue with the known institution. I, on the other hand, felt increasingly that the history department as it then was, later on it changed dramatically, the history department as it then was at Delhi University would take a huge effort to attain worthwhile quality, judging by our failure in previous attempts to do so. And I opted, therefore, to move to JNU. Incidentally, this was a decision that I have never regretted. I did, however, greatly miss the tea room in the Delhi School of Economics and the coffee house chats. And much more than that, the chats with André. casual, off and on, happening, not happening, nevertheless, really very, very incisive and helpful when they did happen. Not that these chats were entirely interdisciplinary, for we often spoke about other matters pertinent to the world around us, and other matters consisted of what was happening in Delhi University. There was always a little bit of gossip thrown in with the question mark, this may or may not be correct. And nevertheless, it was exciting to talk about it. And let me say in conclusion then, that I recall these conversations with André with much pleasure. They were delightful and very meaningful. And together with the pleasure, now there is quite a bit of nostalgia. Thank you.